I chose to present here something that I did last year. It is not a really profound and deep research, but it's an overview of Chinese investments in 3 other BRICS. This research was asked to be made to me by ActionAid Brazil and Institute PAX, and we came up with some data collection on these investments, which I thought would be interesting to compare and to show to you. So just a very quick introduction. As you know, BRICS was one of the marks of the beginning of the 21st century. BRICS has become a major topic of discussion with the financial crisis in 2008, as everyone was discussing the possible decline of the US and the emergence of China as a counterpole in the world economy. What is interesting to show is that BRICS really reached about 30% of the world GDP in the year of the crisis. And even though those countries decreased their GDP, they are now, the last UNCTAD report shows, they together are now with 24% of the world GDP and 20% of global investment flows, which I think it's interesting because it shows the increasing importance of BRICS in general, and specifically China. BRICS has built some spaces of cooperation in different topics, but mainly 2 important common institutions, the New Development Bank and the Contingent Reserve Arrangement. But what is most interesting to me to look at is that despite these spaces of cooperation, which do exist after a decade of BRICS that we have reached now, these countries are really asymmetric. So they're very unequal between them and within them. This is evident in trade relations. So Brazil, South Africa, and Russia are extremely dependent on trade to China and extremely concentrated in primary goods and commodities. India is a little bit different, whereas China exports primarily manufactured products and semi-manufactured. So this trade asymmetry shows or reviews the asymmetry and the political and economic power that China has within the BRICS, which in turn reflects in foreign direct investment. China has become the 2nd largest world investor. In 2016, UNCTAD showed this. China really reached a very high amount of foreign direct investment, which then in the years following 2016, so 2017 and 18, again decreased a little bit because the Chinese government started to take some measures to follow and restrict foreign direct investment, looking especially into real estate, entertainment, and such investments that was called by the Chinese government irrational investment. But still, what I found very interesting, the UNCTAD report shows that China is still the 2nd largest investor in the world and the 2nd largest recipient of foreign direct investment. So this double role of China is very interesting. There are a few motivations and objectives for China to invest abroad. I've listed here a few, so increase of foreign reserves, to ensure the supply of energy goods, energy resources, also food, to find profitable allocations for its overcapacity, capital accumulation, to expand its insertion in technology networks, etc. And finally also to try to foster and come further with the internationalization of the Chinese currency, which is the renminbi. And, a special characteristic of China is the so-called state-led market economy. Some people discuss that. I'm not going into details to this. What is interesting to us is to see how, on the one hand, both private and public Chinese companies, they do follow a market logic, a market rationale, whereas they are still very much guided and directed by the Chinese government, largely focused on China's national development model, national growth. Generally, we can divide Chinese foreign direct investment into 2 different phases. The first is the 1990s and the 2000s, when especially large state-owned company invested abroad looking for natural resources, energy, oil, mining. And the second phase would be from the 2010s onwards, when we had an increasing presence of private multinationals and also increasing investments in other sectors such as technology, real estate, financial services, etc. And this, on the other hand, reflects a sort of geographical division of labor, where you have Latin America, Africa, but also Australia and Asia, with concentrated Chinese investments in energy and natural resources and the infrastructures related to these resources, such as railways, ports, and on the other hand, Chinese investments in the US, which is the main recipient of Chinese investments, and Europe, with a lot of investments in those other more technology-oriented sectors, services, telecommunication, high manufacturing, etc. Here is a general overview of the big numbers, which I got from this data source, which is called China Global Investment Tracker. It's a US-based source, which gives us a general picture of Chinese investments. And there we see, again, we need to follow this. It's a very dynamic research object. So the US is still very much, despite Trump, despite the trade war, is still very much the main recipient of Chinese investment. So the general number is this, almost $2 billion in these more or less a little bit over 10 years, and divided in various sectors, from finance and real estate and chemicals to others. Whereas the three BRICS countries that I'm looking at, of course, they receive much less investments, but still, you see that Brazil, within India, these other three, India, South Africa, and Brazil receives more Chinese foreign direct investment than the others, but extremely concentrated in energy. It's incredible. I'm going to show the map and the graphic that I made. So 65.6 is about 47 billion only in the energy sector in Brazil. So it's really concentrated. And then in India, you have about 29 billion, and then it's more diverse and distributed in energy, transport, manufacturing, health, metals, whereas South Africa is a little less, 14 billion. It's actually decreased in the last year, but also very diverse. So it's interesting because you get an overview that, well, Africa is highly concentrated in oil and mining. It's not. So the main Chinese acquisition in South Africa is a financial acquisition, is the Standard Bank, as I will show. So we can point to the important role of the Chinese Development Bank, or China Development Bank, the CDB, which is the biggest development bank in the world, was only created in 1994, which I found very interesting, and has subsidiaries, one for Africa, one for Latin America, having an increasing role in loans, especially in Latin America in the last 10 years. ECLAC shows about 80% of loans received in Latin America came from the Chinese bank. This research aimed to show, again, I'm not a specialist in China. I always have to say this because my Canadian colleagues complain about my critical view on China. I'm not a specialist. What I look is into the dynamics of foreign direct investments worldwide, and then Chinese direct investments in these three countries. So what I wanted to do was an overview, not a deep look into these investments, looking at those criteria. So the stock of investments, the main companies, multinationals operating in each country, which are the main sectors where they invest, what are the main projects involving Chinese capital, which means also investments by banks of the NDB and other actors, what would be in each of these cases the institutional arrangements around these investments? What are the political actors involved, local, national? What are the banks involved, if I can find some? What are the communities involved in direct investments taking place in territories? And if I find, this was a question, of course, of my research, labor conflicts, environmental impacts, impacts on women communities, etc., which involved Chinese investments in these countries. And in some cases I found a few, in others I couldn't. So it's, of course, limited due to the complexity of each country. Of course, I cannot go into India too deep as I can go into Brazil. And the very dynamic of this object. So it changes a lot. And another problem that we have always when we research foreign direct investment is that we don't have one source where we look into the detail and concrete data. UNCTAD doesn't give us enough material on this. So we need to look in many different sources, which makes all the information fragmented. But okay, we still came up with a few things to show you. For the case of Brazil, well, very, big things, so trade, investment, loans. So we do have an increasing Chinese presence in Brazil in the last 10 years. Trade, as you might know, is one of the main topics of Sino-Brazilian relations. China is the biggest trade partner of Brazil, and Brazil has a trade surplus with China, which is not the reality of the rest of Latin America. So ECLAC shows that only Brazil and Venezuela, if I'm not wrong, also Chile, but I'm not sure about Chile, are the only countries in the region which have a trade surplus and not a trade deficit with China. Still, trade relations between Brazil and China are very unequal. Brazil exports mainly soybeans and iron ore, where Brazil imports manufactured goods from China, and this is very much also reflected in the trade balance in the region. So Latin America exports 72% of primary goods to China, whereas to the rest of the world is more diversified. Concerning investments, I showed you already the number that I have from the China Global Investment Tracker, but the Brazil-China Business Council just released the last report, gave us a number of $58 billion of investments between 2007 and 2018 in about 145 consolidated projects, and they show how Brazil concentrates mainly Chinese investments in the region. 49% of Chinese investment in the Latin American region comes to Brazil, and within this, São Paulo concentrates 35% of these investments. So it's an interesting picture for us. There are different phases of Chinese investments in Brazil, beginning from the 2010 with investments mainly in commodities, then to domestic consumption, industrial sectors, to electronics, automotive industry, for a little bit later to the financial sectors, a little bit of acquisition in banks, to the last phase, which is from 2014 onwards, to energy, transmission belts, and agriculture, which is a new area for Chinese investments. But from all of this, energy is the main sector. It's amazing how the Business Council show from between 2007 and 2018, 53% of Chinese investments in Latin America came to energy, and from these investments specifically to Brazil, which attracted 10 out of the 12 main investments in the region. Okay, so a lot of multinationals here, Sinopec, State Grid. I won't have time to show all of them. But again, I mean, the last period showed also investments in agriculture, transport, aviation, infrastructure, to diversify a little. As I said, so the Chinese Development Bank provided the most credit to Latin America in the last period, about 80%. Venezuela is the main recipient, but Brazil comes in the second position. Brazil received 26% of Chinese credits in the region, and these credits were structured in the mode of loans for oil credits. So the credit to Petrobras, which came in the beginning or mid-2000s, and other credits were structured in that modality that the countries pay with barrels of oil against that money. And ECLAC shows how this is also one of the ways that China is trying to diversify its currency and to use the renminbi as an international currency. I also looked at the NDB credits to Brazil because it's a sort of indirect, although Brazil, of course, is also a member, a founding member of the NDB, of the New Development Bank. But the NDB has, in the last 3 years, funded 4 projects in Brazil. The total amount is 621 millions to BNDES, to subnational governments of Pará, Maranhão, and to Petrobras, and the NDB is opening an office this year in São Paulo. So I've listed here a few ways that Chinese investments in Brazil are politically organized, are politically received, are politically supported, promoted, even though we have, of course, now a new political situation of more uncertainty towards China with the new government. But I will show how actually between Temer and Dilma we had a continuity. We didn't have a change in the relations to China. Diplomacy is one classical way of political support of foreign direct investments. Presidential meetings, visits. We had Xi Jinping, we had the Prime Minister here twice. We had our presidents visiting China. To be sure, Temer's first international trip was to China, to the G20 meeting. Why is that? Why is that I say that we didn't have a really big change after the impeachment, even though we know that the PT administration was more inclined to South-South relations? Actually, because of the very pragmatic interests of many of the Brazilian sectors in trade with China. And on the other hand, the very pragmatic view of China towards its investments in Latin America in general and in Brazil specifically. Some authors would say that China is actually taking some advantage of this new wave of liberalization in the region after the pink tide. Okay. Temer went twice to China, presenting his privatization public-private partnerships agenda, trying to sell projects to Chinese investments. So he was very pragmatic in that. And he met Xi Jinping again last year during the BRICS summit in South Africa, again trying to discuss issues of trade barriers, tariffs for the Brazilian agribusiness. So there wasn't a real big cut. What we had was the case of last year with the election of the Brazilian new president, Bolsonaro, who expressed a lot of criticism towards China, where you had, on the other hand, the support of one of the main economic sectors in Brazil, which is the agribusiness sector, which is a sector that really depends mainly on trade to China to keep on growing. So we can see this ambiguity of being ideologically aligned to Trump, but being, pragmatically dependent on the Chinese market. So we can discuss this later. Some of the other political spaces, spheres, I would say one of them is the Brazil-China Cooperation Fund for Expansion of the Productive Capacity, which was created during Dilma but was put into practice under Temer, which shows again some continuity. The China-LAC Industrial Cooperation Fund, the CLIFE Fund, which has also put some money in Brazil and has also cooperation with the BNDES and Caixa. In terms of Latin America, you have the China-CELAC Forum, which was launched in Havana in 2014. Had some meetings so far, some summits. And for the specific case of Brazil, the Sino-Brazilian High-Level Consultation of Cooperation and Commission, the COSBAN Commission, which was, again, during the first months of this new government, was again on the agenda. This COSBAN, this Cooperation Commission, has launched 2 action plans and 1 cooperation plan. I'm not going into detail of that, but what we found was how these joint action plans had several agreements, again, in the energy sector, counting with a credit from the China Development Bank, giving credit to Petrobras against the export of oil, but also investing in research and development, and etc. To wrap up the case of Brazil, it's the only country where we did find some information on some critics, some conflicts, some issues concerning the living situation of people in the territories, of workers, etc. But what I must say is that we didn't find like a very emblematic conflict against a Chinese company, as we see in other cases. We didn't. What we found is that Chinese investment reinforces the very developmental model that Brazil has, kept in the last 20 years, historically, but was intensified with big infrastructure projects, hydroelectric plants, oil exploration, which, of course, sometimes, in some cases, not always, but we often find some results in some environmental impacts, in some concerns about labor issues, in some concerns about indigenous communities, etc. On the case of agriculture, my colleagues in rural are researching that. It's interesting because Brazil has a very restrictive law, so foreigners cannot buy land in Brazil. So we don't have the case of land grabbing as many people are now discussing. So far, let's hope not. But on the other hand, what we have is a sort of way of escaping the restrictive legislation, through financial acquisitions. So actually Chinese funds and other countries' funds, so this is not restricted to China, are buying shares in Brazilian companies, agricultural groups, and by them they control not only land, but they control the whole supply chain. So in China, it's mainly doing this and did this in the last 5 years. So we have this sort of financial insertion of Chinese capital in Brazilian agribusiness in the last period. Concerning the extractive industries, the very case of the Belo Monte Dam was a case involving state grid and state grid transmission energy belt lines, and it's very well known, the many impacts that it has. I'm not going into that. We found some cases of strikes in the pre-salt oil explorations, also involving Chinese investments. There is this good and interesting study of our colleague Diana Guiar on the Tapajós complex, which involves 6 hydroelectric plants in the Tapajós regions, involving a lot of different Chinese companies and Chinese capital, where you have this very clear situation of which kind of voice, which kind of speech, which kind of hearing these local populations can have when Chinese capital work together with local governments and Brazilian capital. So this, what is general or is particular in this kind of interests. So are these people's interests what we have to look at, or the general interests of these big economic groups opposing rights of peoples in the territories and of those groups? What we have, what I want to emphasize is really the first, a trade dependency between Brazil and China, and this continuous role of Brazil as a supplier of raw materials. So China really reinforces this role, classical division of labor, this role of Brazil as a raw material supplier. We've located these investments in the specific regions. We did a big table with all of the data, so this is a very, very small summary of this. Identify where are the concentrations of these investments. So that you see that in Brazil it's kind of dispersed. You do have in many of the regions, but specifically in São Paulo, which was confirmed by the last Business Council report that just came out last week. So I was very proud that my study confirmed was in line with theirs. Okay. And this is, I'm sorry that it's in Portuguese, this is what the China Global Investment Tracker gives us. So it kind of matches. So I just brought to show it to you. So the case of South Africa, the BRICS presence in Africa was growing in the last 20 years, and China specifically is the main trading partner of the region, one of the main investors, one of the main sources of African imports. How China's presence in Africa in the late 1990s, in the beginning of 2000s, was represented as international aid and cooperation, whereas in the mid-2000s on, you could not only say it's aid and cooperation, it is foreign direct investment. And it was very clear. All the authors are pointing to this kind of turning point in the mid-2000s to a qualitative and quantitative leap of foreign direct investment in Africa, specifically due to China, where you have large state-owned multinationals, but also private multinationals, and not only very large companies, but also medium-sized companies. And there is this one turning point, which was the financial crisis in 2008, which really changed Chinese foreign direct investments worldwide, and changed also in Africa. It's not a coincidence that that was the year when China made this huge acquisition of the Standard Bank of South Africa. It's the biggest Chinese acquisition in Africa so far for $1.5 billion. The bank has branches in all over Africa, and some of the authors have pointed that the acquisition was to facilitate expansion of Chinese investments in natural resources, etc. Different than in Brazil, this is what I found really important. So it's very different, it's very diversified. Brazil is hugely, highly concentrated in energy, but Chinese direct investment in South Africa is not concentrated in natural resources. So it is diversified. You have metals, you have mining, you have energy, but not oil. South Africa is not an oil producer. You have infrastructure, but you also have financial sector, as I said. You also have real estate, and you have telecommunication, a lot of telecommunication companies, and you have a sort of industrial sector, which are the special economic zones. So I found this really interesting how this is diversified, more or less industrialized, also responding to that critique of China, exploiting Africa and South Africa, and China trying to turn that into more industrial investment. Here you have the role of the CDB, but then the CDB branch, again, the CAD fund, China Africa Development Fund, with some specific credits to South Africa, and the NDB. The NDB in South Africa has only so far financed 3 projects, more or less in the same amount of Brazil, 680 million loans, to private companies, Eskom and Transnet, one to the South African Development Bank. But I want to point, because my friends and colleagues there are pointing this so hard, to a huge critic on the NDB credit and the previous credit of the CDB, specifically to the private company Transnet. Transnet is an energy company, it's a huge group, but it's a main investor in the Durban port, which is a huge export hub in Africa. The Durban port is highly polluting. There's a lot of denounces over health problems with the community. So my colleagues there are researching the community's alliances and resistance against the expansion, the duplication of the port. And exactly in that moment, the NDB gives a credit to Transnet, and there's denounces of corruption, etc. So this was a point of criticism. Some of the political legislation framework, I will go very quickly into this. FOCAC, the China-Africa Cooperation Forum, is, as you might already know, one of the main bases of cooperation between China and Africa in general. For a few years, FOCAC Summit was taking place in South Africa with action plans, etc., focusing also on the special economic zones. If you read the FOCAC papers, what they launched, and FOCAC has also been a space where you see foreign aid and investments very close together, being represented as responding to the development needs of Africa. So this is one point to discuss. We do have the China-Africa Business Forum, and the South African chapter of the BRICS Business Forum has pointed to other different policies of the South African government to foster, to promote foreign direct investment and Chinese foreign direct investment. So trade liberalization, tariffs liberalization, national development plan, industrial policy action plan. But I want to point to two issues that I've been looking more concrete, which is the Investment Protection Act of 2015, which gives most favored conditions to foreign direct investors. In the same period, when South Africa was canceling some of the bilateral investment treaties with European countries, reforming its model of bilateral investment treaties, which South Africa has with China, the country was also reforming its legislation. So despite not having a foreign direct bilateral investment treaties with other countries, South Africa is reforming its own legislation to facilitate foreign direct investment, not necessarily having a treaty with other countries. So I found this an interesting point to look at. But still, with China, South Africa maintains a bilateral investment treaty, which is until today not unchanged, from 1998 until today. Again, the case of the special economic zones, as I said already, so they are put in this package of foreign aid and investment together. But what my colleagues now have been pointing in many of their publications and research is how the special economic zones have been actually false promises of creating jobs, because in the end they are very much computerized, they are not so labor intensive. So the promise, the expectations of job creations, of industrialization was not necessarily met. And then you have the whole discussion of labor pacts trying to escape labor legislations. And in the end, how the special case of COEGA, which is a special economic zone where the Beijing Automotive Group has a very important presence, where this job promise was not narrow fulfilled. So this is to wrap up with South Africa. So this is the map. As you see, Johannesburg and Pretoria, there, the financial centers, again, goes against our common sense view that, so you see the diversification of many different areas, so that you see that China is not only into natural resources in Africa. And this is also here verified in the global China Global Investment Tracker, again, also finance as one of the main sectors. So my conclusion of this study is that you don't have a single pattern of Chinese investment. So China really adapts to each of the partners. That is my conclusion to that. But for the case of India, of course, it's a natural difference in comparison to Brazil and South Africa, because you're here dealing with two Asian powers competing in the same region. And they really do geopolitically compete in this region, which makes a combination. So China-India relation is a combination of geopolitical dispute with growing and increasing economic interests. This is our main conclusion of this. There are lots of tensions because of the Belt and Road Initiative going into Pakistan and the Kashmir region. As you know, now Kashmir is a huge problem right now to Modi. Modi was re-elected very recently, continuing his liberalization policy. But you had 2 years ago, in 2017, this almost military conflict in the region of Bhutan between China and India, which was a case for the BRICS. Would BRICS survive that? So this rivalry is very much intense between China and India. But on the other hand, you do have growing economic interest concerning trade and concerning investments. Concerning trade, you do have in the last 10 years growing trade volumes, but for the case of India, India has a deficit with China and kept this deficit, whereas the trade issue, the trade content is against very unequal. So export of raw materials, whereas India imports manufactured goods. There is the authors normally they point to a sort of lack of trust between both partners. India demanding more flexibilization from China for Indian firms to enter the Chinese markets, and China's firms wanting to enter India, but still very reluctant to this. And for the case of FDI, of foreign direct investment, you do have growing numbers in the last period. UNCTAD is also pointing to this, but it's still very low if you compare to the general numbers of foreign direct investment in India. So China is not one of the main investors. It is investing in different sectors such as pharmaceutical, auto industry, technology, but it's startups. But it's still, we're going to see that concentrated in some sectors such as infrastructure. One of the authors that we read and studied for this research was pointing, I think it's interesting to mention, how the labor costs, salaries in India are so much lower than in China that this would attract Chinese investment. So you can imagine how the labor and work conditions are if we picture China as one of the main countries giving lower salaries to its workers. So, but for the case of the banks, what I found interesting is that, okay, China and India do have this rivalry, but India is one of the main recipients of credits from both banks. From the NDB, India has already 8 projects in a total of 2.5 billion loans. And for the case of the Asian AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is clearly led by China, whereas the NDB is more democratic to the other BRICS partners. For the case of the AIIB, India has 10 different projects already receiving a lot of money, and the AIIB is one of the main credit providers for the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a problem for India. More importantly, India is the second country with most share within the AIIB, only behind China. So that you see that you do have rivalry in the geopolitical sphere, but you do have spaces of dialogue, of bargaining, of cooperation in some aspect, in the case of the IIB, which is, I think, one of the main cases of economic cooperation, because it's a concrete financial institutions. Okay, so I think this is something that shows an interesting point between India and China. You do have many different MOUs between both countries. 2 major programs that the Indian government has launched in the recent years to attract foreign direct investment, Make in India, Invest India. These 2 programs do promote, foster foreign direct investments, and within those also Chinese investments. There was bilateral investment treaties between India and China, but this treaty has already terminated 2 years ago, although its rules are still going because of the residual effect of these rules. So you do have protection of Chinese investments in India and Indian investments in China. And China and India have a strategic economic dialogue with a special way, a special mechanism from China to deal with some countries. China doesn't have this special economic dialogue with many countries, but does have with India. So what I would say then to wrap up is that you do have a more horizontal space of relation, of bargaining between India and China, where you don't have it with South Africa and Brazil. So to finalize, here is the map of India. Here we do have some difference because if we count the investments of the AIIB and the NDB, you have more in infrastructure, where on the other hand, you can go to only foreign direct investment from firms, not the banks. You have some numbers for the energy sector. So, okay, what I want to say is, so to really finalize that China's development is a two-way street in the way that it has developed in the last decades, from the 70s on, creating specific conditions for foreign direct investments to come to China, foreign and national investments to really develop national firms, to really develop national technology, to come and to stay in China, not just come, invest, and go. So really fostering the Chinese growth model, which then turned a few decades later to turn China not only as a recipient of foreign direct investment, but also as a foreign investor, becoming, as you all know, a big economic power, a big economic pull in the Asian region, and also now counter-pulling with the US, and then turns China a main investors in those regions which are historically overexploited colonial regions in the global south. And then you have these three countries, so Asia, South Africa and Latin America, in the case of Brazil, South Africa, and India. And as I've already said, we don't find a single pattern of Chinese investment. So China is very pragmatic. It suits to each partner. It deals with each partner, so that we have those differences that I've pointed with those countries. So just to summarize, Brazil receives investments mainly in energy, maintains a surplus in trade, but it's a very unequal trade. South Africa has received Chinese investments before Brazil, is the main recipient in Africa, still is an intermediate power between China and the African countries, but Chinese investments in South Africa are very diversified and going more and more into the parts of manufacturing and special economic zones. Whereas for the case of India, you have this combination of geopolitical tensions and economic interests, showing, of course, that you deal with two of the main Asian powers trying to, pose themselves against each other. So thank you so much.